series on race and racial justice. Thank you for joining us tonight. Just a couple of notes. If you are watching this on the Waterloo Catholics website page, I'll just remind you that at the bottom of the page, there is a link to an evaluation form for tonight's discussion. Please take advantage of that. There's also information at the bottom of the page on how to submit questions if you have questions for our guest tonight. And while you're on the page, I would remind you to take a look at how the program is explained there. We were very careful to plan this summer forum and the individual programs with the recommendations of the American bishops, so that we would be doing exactly what the bishops have asked American Catholics to do. And you'll kind of see that rationale explained on the Summer Forum webpage. Our guest this evening is the Reverend Abraham Funches. Reverend Funches is a pastor of Jubilee United Methodist Church in Waterloo. He's also the executive director of the Waterloo Human Rights Commission. Reverend Funches, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Director.
It is a pleasure and an honor to have you participating in the forum.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invite. I think this is a wonderful series, very educational, and I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, let me start with a question about you. I understand you grew up in South Carolina?
Yes, I did. Yeah, St. Matthews.
At what age did you leave South Carolina?
18, I guess.
So
I went to
most
college.
of your youth was spent there.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if there was a particular time or a circumstance in your life there, or maybe later, where you realized that you were not white, or you realized that it made a difference that you were not white. Do you have recollection of that, or was it just always something you took for granted?
I think it's something that you kind of grew up understanding, you know, because obviously my parents, they were active during the civil rights movement. And so from very early on, they were talking about Dr. King and the civil rights movement there in Orangeburg, South Carolina, where there were 3 people who were killed, you know, by the police right there at Claflin College and South Carolina State University. They're close together. And so, you know, there's always been an inescapable reality, understanding that our Black bodies would be viewed differently in a quote unquote white world. And then in the town that we lived, we also had another physical reminder. There was a big ditch that the railroad track was in. And we were always told that big tunnel, so to speak, was built and dug out by slaves. And obviously somewhat like Waterloo to some degree, with the river dividing the city between west and east, that railroad track was a symbol of division between east and west there in St. Matthews, South Carolina. And it's still there, but a lot of the whites lived on one side and a lot of the Blacks lived on the other. So it was a constant reminder, you know, of who we were in the community.
Okay, thank you. I want to just give a little context for the discussion tonight and why I ask you to discuss this question of what white people don't understand about people of color. I remember when I first came to Waterloo many years ago. First of all, I came from Dubuque, so that gives you an idea that my experience of people of color was very, very limited. And I worked for a pastor who sent me to a number of meetings and workshops that were organized by Anna Mae Weems.
Yeah.
And I think it was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference people who were doing those workshops. And I always remembered how anime would often begin a program by saying to the mostly white audience, when you look at me, do you see a woman or do you see a black woman? And then she would go around and call on people, and all of us white people thinking the correct answer was, we just see a woman, we just see a woman. And then she would say, well, folks, either you're blind or you're lying, because I'm a black woman, and when you look at me, you should see a black woman. What I learned from that was the fact that you cannot not see a person's color. And if you pretend that you don't, you're trying to kid yourself.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, the other thing that I think it seemed to me that came out of those experiences was this awareness that it's not fair either to just say, this person is just like me, except this color of their skin is different. That there are deeper differences in all of us that come from our background and our heritage and our cultural experience. And so always seemed to me that it's not really fair to just say, well, they're just like me, except they have a different color skin. So that's kind of the point of tonight's discussion, is for you to help us understand those deeper and more important differences and commonalities, because we also have a lot in common. But so that makes sense for?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense, especially when
I'm just going to kind of give you the forum to kind of talk about what it is that, in your experience, white people just don't know or don't get or have a hard time accepting about people of color. So
right.
Start there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that you ask, because I don't know, inherently it does kind of presuppose that Black people, Indigenous people, or people of color are somewhat monolithic or something like that. And so there's just this 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 items of understanding that if we just grasp that, we would have a better appreciation for who these folks are. And I think it's far more complex than that, obviously. It's kind of difficult to understand what you might not understand about me or about people that look like me. But obviously, that does speak to the complexity of being alive in America. And I know Nicole obviously did a wonderful job talking about the historical backdrops of what shaped us. But James Baldwin, I think, did a wonderful job, I think in a piece called The Price of the Ticket, when he talked about history. History is not just something to be read, Baldwin would say. History is something that has to be experienced to some degree. It's something that we carry around with us. It's in our person wherever we go. And he further went on to say that we are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And it provides our frame of reference. It tells us something about our identities and our aspirations. It is literally, history is literally with us in the present. And so I thought it was beautiful, the fact that you would have Nicole Hannah-Jones, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, MacArthur Genius Award winner, to start this conversation off for your summer series, because history really is so critically important. I think James Baldwin talked about it, and he, along with several others, noted that oftentimes, you know, we try to escape the history, which is inescapable. And so obviously Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color, they look at history in one way, and the history has shaped us. It has shaped our aspirations, it's shaped our responses, you know, as we live in what we consider to be a white context because of structural racism, institutional racism, this notion of white supremacy, the reality of white supremacy. And we have always had to deal with that. It is inescapable. It's not something that we can't deal with. There are consequences if we don't govern ourselves in a certain way that will allow us to survive. And of course, George Floyd, once again, is a constant reminder of those kinds of things. As I'm sure has been discussed, George Floyd was just a symptom of a situation that's been going on from the founding of this nation. It's remarkable that people seem to suggest that the light came on with the George Floyd situation, but there have been so many situations that have led up to George Floyd. Black people have been, quite frankly, dealing with death at the hands of police from the very founding of the nation. So there's nothing remarkable about what George Floyd experienced for us, but there was something different this time go around. But it still leaves us somewhat cynical because we've seen these situations come and go before. Rodney King in the 90s, when people saw Rodney King get beat up the way he did by 10 officers or something like that, I'm sure people said then, oh, we're going to do things differently this time. And of course, you know, wise, well-meaning people took advantage of the moment and did try to exact some change in order to build on love and reconciliation in the community. When Trayvon Martin was killed, the community came together. They coalesced around that moment. And once again, people said, you know, this must stop. We must do things. And then we can say the same thing with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, then George Floyd, and all of the other people before and between. And so I don't know, I think a lot of Black people that I talk to feel that this is just, you know, just another moment in time that we want to obviously take advantage of in terms of maximizing the capacity to spread love and reconciliation as far as it would go. But in terms of believing that anything beyond the superficial will occur, we're cynical. And I feel that Nicole Hannah-Jones would agree with that, because I'm sure she would say that as a student of history, there have always been ebbs and flows. There was great promise during Reconstruction, during the latter part of the 1800s, when Black men were becoming congresspeople. But then, of course, that went on for about 12 years, and then that whole effort was smashed. And then there have been examples of individuals that would do well. But then after a while, you know, any advances or, you know, shining exemplars of what is possible in this democratic experiment that we call America would be crushed. And then there'd be Jim Crow and segregation. And then all of this is, you know, historically speaking, has been marked by theft of wages, killing and destruction of Black bodies, beatings and whippings. Going back to Baldwin, history is what we carry within us. It's not something merely to be read. It does not principally refer to something in the past. It is something that we carry around with us, and we are unconscionably controlled by it in many ways. This is the same thing that's happening with people who have a history of abuse, segregation, marginalization. There's nothing new there. But having said all that, obviously every situation, like the moment that we're living in, presents new opportunities. And it would be foolish of us not to try to maximize the moment in any and every way that we can. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You must have your system on mute.
Talk a little bit about how, as an individual today, or a family of color today, how that history actually makes a difference. I mean, the awareness of it is part of it, but do you think differently as you go about normal things in your daily life, or are you really conscious of that when you interact with so-called white people? My wife reminded me tonight, you know, we're not really white, and we're all different shades, but for simplicity's sake, we'll say white people.
Right, 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 right. I mean, well, you know, it's difficult to get away from the reality of being a black body in a white world, especially when you're bombarded with images of, you know, police brutality, which is the face of racist oppression in this nation. Having said that, it doesn't mean that people are not somehow able to, you know, survive and circumvent the aggressions, the microaggressions, the macroaggressions that serve to hold us back or push us back. But it is a constant reminder that there is still this force out there that's embodied in people, quite frankly, that are white. But you know what's interesting about that, by the way, and I must say this, Kendi, and we hope to have some more discussions about this in the community. Kendi likes to take some time and point out that either you're racist or you're anti-racist. It's overly simplistic, I understand. But I think the larger point that he's trying to teach is that you're either for, you know, trying to dismantle racism in America, or you're not doing anything at all to disrupt racist and colonial type systems in America. So you either are, you know, for racist structure or you are anti-racist. And a lot of people, interestingly enough, in Kendi's mind, can be included in those two camps. And so that is an interesting twist. It's a little different than what Jane Elliott talked about when she said what she said about Black people not having power, and therefore Black people can't be racist. And so I think Kendi is actually, you know, taking that into account a little bit. Now he's saying that, look, we live in a white supremacist structure, but he is acknowledging that there are Black people that have limited power, and they can be complicit too within a racist structure, which we all know. We know that, you know, as Kendi has eloquently and very simply put forward, is that either you are engaged in racist activity or anti-racist activity. And to some degree, it begins to move away from just color, because sometimes we get so caught up in the identity politics, so to speak, and it has more to do with class and systems and structures that serve to control our lives. But yeah, but it's very difficult for Black people to escape the reality that you're Black, you know, a white supremacist, racist, capitalist structure that we know as America today, with all of its flaws and all of its historical oppressions and that kind of thing. It's very difficult to get away from that reality because we, once again, to quote Baldwin, we carry the history within us, and we are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And I would go even further to say that it would behoove all of us to know that history. Now, for Black people to know the history is one thing, but for white people to also appreciate that Black history is Anglo-Saxon, or white people's history as well. I think that was the point, you know, if I might say this, that Nicole was basically making, that you know, this is American history, and people within the field of historiography, they like to try to tell the story the way they want to tell the story, and it does leave room for scholars like her to help point out certain things that people are not aware of. For instance, one learns about the Mayflower that came in 1620, but you know, in all of the curricula in schools all across this nation, you learn about the Mayflower. But did you know about the white lion that brought the African Americans in 1619? We didn't really get that in school. It's not until you know, a Black person, an indigenous person, or another person of color, for instance, may actually take that history and decide that this is something that's worth telling too. And then we began to appreciate that there's a little bit more to, you know, this land we know as North America than we initially thought, by virtue of what was being taught, what was being communicated. And it affects not just the Black child, but it affects the white child too. And so we just have to have a deeper appreciation for history and engage in truth telling, so that we all have a better appreciation for, you know, the origins of what made this nation what it is today.
Mhm. I got the same impression from Nicole that she that, you know, part of the our awareness is that as white people, we are also products of our history, and that we need to be
Absolutely.
aware of that, how that shapes how we act, how we think,
Thank you.
how we value things in the real world that we live in, multicultural world.
Yeah.
The question of, I guess, I wanted to ask you how, what I wanted to say was, I'm searching here in my memory here. You alluded to this, and we had said this before we started tonight, that I wanted very intentionally to acknowledge the fact that we are talking in generalities, which
Sure.
isn't fair to individuals, because every Black person or person of color is not like every other person of color, and every white
Right.
person isn't like every other white person. So let's acknowledge the fact that that is a truth, but there is a kind of a corporate reality, I think, or a communal reality that is the area that we're talking about tonight. So for
Sure.
any person who's listening and say, well, that's not me, well, to some degree or not, that might not be me, or that might not be you. I'm curious to know, in this kind of general sense, what you or a person of color, a Black person, assumes about the white people in general that they encounter in daily life. What's
Right. I mean,
going on in our heads?
right. You know, quite frankly, I'm at a point in my life, I guess, Director Cushing, where I realize that individuals are different, that we all made differently, and obviously, you know, with this philosophical, theological conversation that we're, you know, are talking about tonight, I believe that everybody has the imago Dei in their lives, and so that is always something to keep in mind. It was always remarkably something that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King always seemed to keep in the forefront of his thinking, that there was always possibility, you know, in the people that he worked with. I remember that Larry Stummy, you know, Dr. Stummy, he said that he was there on the bridge when they turned around and went back, and then Dr. King, you know, talked about how, you know, we've got to learn how to love even the oppressor. But he said it in such a way that the hatred and the passion that had, you know, risen in the chest of Larry Stummy had to subside after he heard what Dr. King had to say about learning how to love even the oppressor, or the one who intended to do one harm. And that's just a remarkable thing. So the idea of, first of all, recognizing that everyone has the imago Dei in their lives, and I think that's very special, the image of God in their lives. And so from a theological perspective, I'm mindful of that in my own thinking and in my own work. But I also am concerned, because my background is sociology, I'm concerned about groups. You know, it's one thing, you know, to say that certain individuals have managed to seemingly lift themselves up by their bootstraps and become marvels, you know, but as someone just recently said, not too long ago at a big award ceremony, just because we're magic to some degree, and he was referring to Black people at that particular time, but just because we're magic, it doesn't mean that we still don't have issues and have to deal with certain socio-political realities. And those socio-political realities are the thing, quite frankly, that people don't want to deal with. And we've run into some of that even locally. It's a national, international phenomenon, but even locally, because we all caught up in the human predicament together, people just don't want to acknowledge that inequity and inequality still exist and take on existential expression, I guess, in certain indices of life that we can easily measure. For instance, home ownership. One of the things that we know even within our own community here in Waterloo or in the Cedar Valley is that Black people as a group rent 70% of the time versus 30% of home ownership. And it's just inverted for white people. With respect to unemployment, pre-COVID, we experienced, I guess, 3 to 5% unemployment. But when we began to look at Black people in particular, that went all the way up to 20% and higher. And I never forgot, how some of the political leaders, even religious leaders in the community, were saying that it could not be that high. It could not be as high as 24% unemployment for Blacks. It must be more like 20 or 19%. But, obviously, when things are really tough for any community, there are thresholds of pain. And at some point, you pass a certain threshold, and it doesn't matter really, how bad it really is after a certain point. All you know is that it's bad. And so, those things are very special. But the incarceration rate in the local jail, about 50% Afro-American. These are the social political realities that we're dealing with right here at home for us. And so when we look at those kinds of numbers, this is the data. This is the data that has become a part of our history and our present. That is the thing that Baldwin talked about, that the history is literally present with us. And it might sound a little oxymoronic, but this is our socio-political reality, and it requires that we muster up the courage, obviously, to deal creatively with those numbers. Now, this is not as much a reflection on current leadership, although it could be. But the reality is that those kinds of numbers haven't really changed very much since Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. And then, of course, prior to that, I'm just using King as a marker. But think about it. For the last 50 some years, there's always been this kind of inequity or inequality present in community, which is also demonstrated by educational inequity, this residential segregation that we see within the community today. The reality is that, as I was talking about the railroad track in St. Matthews, South Carolina, we've got a river that divides the community. And most of the Black people are concentrated in the northeast section of town, and whites are in other parts of the community on the other side of the railroad track, these kinds of things. These are our social political realities. To ignore the reports that we learn about, that teach us this data in the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, and pretend that these inequities or these social political realities don't exist, is I think worse than the data itself, because it suggests that leadership is in a state of denial, whether they be white leaders and or Black leaders. You're in a state of denial, and that is more dangerous than the reality itself, because it suggests we're not going to do anything to fix it. And so it's imperative, in my mind, that we have to engage in truth telling. We have to engage in truth telling so that we can speak truth to power. This is the theological tradition. This is in the tradition of Dr. King and everybody that came before Dr. King, obviously. But the idea of speaking truth to power, and of course, Dr. King during the Civil Rights Movement did a remarkable job. And of course, we understand that Dr. King represents so many other men and women and gay and straight individuals that were involved in that Civil Rights Movement, white folks as well as Black folks and that kind of thing. And so we mentioned Dr. King because he certainly was an eloquent spokesman for the movement. But Dr. King at some point realized that he was fighting for civil rights. And indeed, over like a decade period, they did accomplish a lot with the support of a lot of different people working together. But at some point, just before he was killed, Dr. King realized that, it's one thing to gain access to sitting at the lunch counter. But what's the point of sitting at the lunch counter if you still don't have the money to buy the hamburger? And he began to focus on the economics of it all, the economic disparities, the great gaps in wealth accumulation. And interestingly enough, he was snuffed out by an assassin's bullet in '68, just as he was working on the Poor People's Campaign, as he was working with sanitation workers in Memphis. The story is very revelatory, but obviously even today, we have made a lot of gains in terms of civil rights. But as we continue to expand the conversation and talk about human rights and wealth inequality, then we have a long ways to go. There's a bright spot in Asheville, North Carolina. I think the city council voted unanimously to provide reparations for the 12% Black population there in Asheville, North Carolina. It is noted as a liberal group, a liberal city that has taken upon itself to start doing some things to try to rectify the wrongs of yesteryear. And so I think what they want to embark upon is, creating a movement to start affordable housing, to make sure that they break up the segregation in such a way where it sends certain youth to schools that don't have all of the resources versus the schools in other parts of town that have all the resources and these kinds of things. And it is certainly a start. It is a very welcome start. And I just say, unfortunately, very cynically, we have to see how long that, that push or that movement lasts. Because quite frankly, history is a long record of the fact that whenever we see progress, that typically is a white or fascist backlash. And we anticipate, if history is a teacher, and history is what we're carrying around with us, with pain and with terror. This is what Baldwin talks about. With pain and with terror, the realization that we're carrying history with us in our person, makes us aware that, the worst is probably yet to come. The worst is probably yet to come.
Can you talk a little bit about how this history shapes the person of color's experience and understanding of family and family life?
Well, for me, I guess I can talk about me and my family, my extended family in particular. This history, this experience taught us the importance of education. We've always been indoctrinated to believe that it is critical to go to school, go to college, get the degrees, because in some ways that is an equalizer. At least that's the way we were taught. And you can see by virtue of the number of educators in my family, that people took that to heart. Now, granted, they started, my granddad and my grandmother, they were farmers on my mother's side. They were farmers. They had a lot of land, and they grew a lot of things on the land. They created sugar and jam and all this on the land. They had hogs, and so they had pork chops and everything right there. And my grandfather was a tobacco grower, and so I remember as a youth driving the tractor down the rows of tobacco while they were cropping, and I was driving the harvester. You couldn't tell me that I wasn't doing anything important, because I knew I had a very important job. I had to keep it straight in the rows so that they could do what they had to do. But you know, the installation of hard work and the idea of working very early in the morning. And my uncle would say, for instance, that granddad would, you know, very early in the wee hours of the morning, like 4 o'clock or whatever, when you just begin to see a ray of sunshine coming through the window, he would stand up in the door frame and he would simply say, "Rise." and they just automatically got up. Now, I think he was exaggerating a little bit, but nonetheless, he would say, Granddad came to the door and he would just say, "Rise." And everybody understood that it was time to go to work. Well, it was because of this work ethic that was drilled into so many of these folks that they obviously began to turn this work ethic into, you know, the other endeavors that they pursued, and many of them became educators. And to that degree, we feel that, you know, it's important to try to do the best you can to maximize every moment that comes your way, because for one, it's critically important to try to have something of your own, something that you can own. This was something that was continually impressed upon, for instance, me, my brother, my sister, other young people that were growing up in the family. So we always had this sense of community, because we would meet often, especially around Easter and Christmas time in particular, regardless of where we dispersed to. We always came back to the house around Christmas time. We'd eat a big meal and everybody would engage in storytelling, but it was also opportunity to monitor where people were on their journey in terms of how well were they, you know, successfully navigating these pitfalls that are out here if you slip and if you fall. And family was ready to support and help in any way that they could. And so the idea that we needed to, you know, to succeed to some level so that we could in turn take care of our families and keep, you know, generations of people strong, whatever that looked like, that was instilled in me at an early age. It's something that I think resonates with me today, and it affects the way I talk to people today. We know the possibilities are real. I wrote a children's book, as you know, Director Cushing. I wrote a children's book, Rise. But within that book, what I try to relate to younger people today is that there are certain expectations that, you know, the elders have of you as a part of the village. We have certain expectations of you to be successful, to be diligent, to rise. You know, the Chinese say something like, one cannot rise early 365 days of the year and not be rich. You know, and I know theologically speaking, we're not just, you know, teaching financial prosperity, but we're talking about being rich in every way imaginable. Having a heart that's open enough to appreciate the richness of other human beings as well. But the idea of rising and rising early, that was something that was indoctrinated in me. It was something that obviously I try to share with others as well in my work, even to this day. But it was definitely something that I found that was crystallized in the way that I even spoke with the young people in the book Rise, because I thought it was foundational to my development, and I thought it would be helpful to anyone else, and the families who would take the time to read it. And to my delight, there are some teachers that thought that the book reads well. And I've had an opportunity to read it in different spaces and places, but the children like it. So it makes me feel good, obviously, as author.
Okay. Listening to you talk about how hard you worked as a child, and the expectation that families have for their children to work hard, from my very limited experience with people, white or of color, who have been marginalized or disadvantaged, I've come to the conclusion that it is really hard work to be poor.
Yeah.
That those of us who live comfortable middle-class lives have no idea how hard it is actually when you survive from day to day or week to week or month to month. But I'm wondering if you have a sense for why a lot of us white people have the impression that poor people, whether they're people of color or white, are just lazy. Just our,
Yeah. I think it's because of the indoctrination that we're living in the land of the free, and this notion that, you know, you can be all you want to be in these United States of America. You just got to apply yourself. I think because of that, and because we have actually seen individuals, you know, kind of pull themselves up by the proverbial bootstraps, perhaps, and actually make something of themselves. I think that is interesting, and I think that's why people have a tendency to say that. But I think it also reflects, once again, going back to Baldwin, the history that we carry within us, regardless of, you know, what we might think or say. We are carrying around a history that's been transferred to us through generation after generation after generation. And we've seen it being reinforced by all of the symbolism that we've seen in these continental United States of America. You know, the right question is just this year that people are beginning to pull down these Confederate flags and these Confederate statues. It's just this year that they're beginning to pull down all of these symbols of an era where people were fighting to maintain slavery. They were so interested in maintaining slavery that they were willing to fight to defend this way of life, even to the point of seceding from the United States of America and start their own thing. Well, it's impossible to believe that people could have believed in protecting the Confederacy like this without transferring something to every child that was born in every household down south and beyond. The fact that we could continue to, quite frankly, as a nation, I mean, it's just remarkable. They were the losers. The Confederacy lost, and they were, you know, willing to secede from the Union, but yet, for the longest time, we were flying these flags, you know, putting them on our cars, you know, flying them over state capitals and what have you, reinforcing this history. And so those kinds of thoughts, ideas get, you know, obviously indoctrinated into us. And I think that's why. And then, of course, just simply not understanding history or understanding social political realities. People choose to believe the worst about, you know, certain groups of people, obviously, that they want to use as scapegoats, especially if they want to compare themselves to another group of people in order to justify where they are in life. And so it's all part of, as I call, the human predicament. But in this situation in the United States of America, we social scientists refer to it as white supremacy. You know, obviously the prevalence of racism, institutional racism, to preserve these belief systems and codify them in such a way that they become a way of life. It's a constant reminder to Black people that we were not a part of the original conversation. Nicole Hannah-Jones, I think, does a wonderful job, in my view, in terms of talking about the founders of this nation, did not have Black people in mind when they were talking about, the pursuit of life, freedom, happiness, these kinds of things. It was not Black people that were being discussed. There were fellow white individuals, or the WASP, the Western Anglo-Saxon Protestants. These were the people that were being talked about. I don't know if we were afterthoughts or if we were thought about at all. But the reality is that this is the context that I grew up in, and I began to understand as I listened to my family members talk to me about the history of what we were dealing with. And then, of course, when I was being born, coming on the heels of the modern civil rights movement, understanding that Dr. King was shot and killed. And then you try to understand, well, why was he shot and killed? And it's because he was doing A, B, C, and D to try to bring people together and this kind of stuff. And then later on in life, you learn about the letter from Birmingham jail. And in this letter, you began to see people who were arch defenders of the status quo, represented by the white ministers of at that time, who were telling Dr. King that, Dr. King, you're being untimely and unwise. And Dr. King had to respond and say, you can't put a timetable on another man's journey. When people yearn to be free, they want to be free, and they don't want to wait until you think it's convenient that I be free in every way imaginable. How dare you, in so many words, tell me when I should, be vocal about my own freedom when you have everything that I aspire to be, if we're supposed to be equal. And I think people don't appreciate sometimes that it wasn't just Dr. King and the people during his era, Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer. It wasn't just these people, but way back from the foundation of the world, there's always been this sense of political resistance against oppression. These people were killed when they stood up to their oppressors. They were killed, they were maimed, they were lynched. The families were separated, they were robbed, they were beaten mercilessly. And family members witnessed this. And how could that not become fossilized within the body? And that would ultimately be transferred from generation to generation after witnessing and seeing such a thing. It started even beyond, with the Middle Passage, people jumping overboard because they refused to be enslaved by another, because all they've ever known was freedom. So they jumped overboard. They did not like this notion of being packed in a ship like sardines and giving the oppressor the satisfaction of believing that they were going to be docile and simply be complicit with this thing. But over time, obviously, you beat people into submission, and this is a story, a lesson that sticks with you for a lifetime, and you pass it on so that people will learn how to navigate the pitfalls on your journey and make sure that you're able to rise and resist in a way that builds and saves community all at the same time.
Talk a little bit about the role of religion, the church's faith in this history. It seemed to me there was always this tension. I mean, it's tension in human life, but particularly for African Americans, between faith to be used as kind of a consolation for the pain and the suffering that one experiences, and on the other hand, to be kind of emboldened with the courage to hope for more and to actually act for more. Do you experience that today, even in your ministry?
Yeah, as I continue to grow as a human being, as I continue to grow as a man of faith, I revisit that history from time to time. Also in my conversations with people like Michael D. Blackwell, who's around here, and other people that I know and love. But vicariously, we also read people like James Cone, who wrote The Cross and the Lynching Tree. You know, there was a time in church history, I think, when the church, obviously during the modern civil rights movement, seemed to take the meaning of church life to a different level than we are today. Now, granted, you know, the brother who wrote, you know, this book on, you know, the church's complicity in racism, Tisby, he makes the point that early on the church actually, you know, put a rubber stamp on slavery and the vicious cruelty that was happening to Black people. And this is what causes such disillusionment among people today. And he does a really good job. We had a book discussion on it. And so, you know, it was a wonderful discussion and we learned a lot. You know, we continue to get insights from, you know, that historian's, you know, finding of the truth, for which we are appreciated. But getting back to Cone with the cross and the lynching tree, he says it's unfortunate, Cone does. It's unfortunate that you have the cross on one hand, that's representative of hope and salvation, but then you have the lynching tree on the other, which is the negation of all that hope and salvation. And for whatever reason, there is, you know, no connection between the two symbolisms, the hope on one hand and the lynching tree on the other. Unfortunately, the cross has become this harmless ornament that people just gladly wear around their necks or put in their jewelry cabinets, without understanding the real cost of discipleship, which is what the cross seems to, or the lynching tree seems to represent. And then when you think of Jesus, you know, being hung up on a cross, and you think of Black men and women who were hung up on a tree, it's amazing, Cone says, that nobody ever really made those comparisons before. So he did it. And what he points out to us is that we have gotten away from understanding that Jesus, who was crucified by the state, by the way, you know, always seemed to have advocated for the marginalized, the oppressed people of a community, those who were hurting, you know, and who were oppressed by the systems of community. Today, the church, for whatever reason, seems in too many instances the arch defender of the status quo, in the same way that the church was complicit in racism early on in terms of supporting slavery and Jim Crow and all these other isms that adversely affected Black people and indigenous people and other people of color. The church is kind of doing that again today. And we can see it if we're honest with ourselves. We don't, I would dare say that many folk who are church goers don't really seem to appreciate the vision that Cone has, or that Dr. King had, or that Frederick Douglass had, or Fannie Lou Hamer, when they thought that the church is supposed to be a vehicle of liberation for people who were oppressed. You know, and I tell you that the sense of the cost of discipleship, that is so far removed from many parishioners today in mainline denominations, it seems, that the cost of discipleship, the idea that your faith as you follow Jesus Christ, who was killed by the state. I got to add that because I think sometimes we forget the fact that Jesus was killed by the state. So how can we be arch defenders of the status quo and still say you're celebrating and you're moved by Jesus, and he was killed by the state? He was killed by the state. I think we forget that. Do we conveniently forget that Jesus was killed by the state? I think we do. I think we do. He was killed by the state. And so in that sense, I think Cone would say that connects the lynching that took place in these United States and America, how his body was destroyed by the state, how lynchies were destroyed by the lynching was such a phenomenon that up to 20,000 people would come to see the spectacle, and they would lynch these Black bodies, Black men in particular, but Black women too. And they would even cut off the, the knuckles and the toes and other body parts, save as souvenirs to mark the occasion that they were there at the lynching. They would put photos on postcards. This is American history. This is Afro-American history. This is Anglo-Saxon history. And again, this is the history that we carry around in us. To deny that this is a part of our history is tantamount to rewriting history as it happened. And this serves no one well, because the reality is that we carry the history around in us, and history is literally present, and it affects many of the decisions that we are making, even today. And so these are the kinds of things that are still with us, even as we do church. We have lofty ideas in the church. And of course, no question about it, the foundational pieces in Catholicism, the United Methodist Church, and other pieces that I've seen, the social principles or social justice, on paper, we've got some wonderful stuff there. And we do have exemplars of individuals too who have done some remarkable things in terms of reaching out for the poor, rich history of abolitionism when slavery came around, and this kind of thing. But obviously there are a lot of people too who have somehow twisted all of the good that the church is supposed to represent in terms of liberation for those who are struggling or marginalized or on the brink of disaster. And found that they were more complicit with the systems that be, to crush people who were looking to the church for hope. And to me, this is what we still see embodied in a lot of our churches today. We still see, unfortunately, the church not being so much a beacon of light, or as Dr. King said, the headlight and not the tail light. What we see, quite frankly, are a lot of churches with big buildings who serve to be arch defenders of the status quo. We see all of the systemic oppression, and the churches, unfortunately, are extremely quiet. And silence is complicity.
Do you see this as a challenge for the historically Black churches as well?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, once again, going to Kendi, either you are, and he makes this dichotomy, but Kendi talks about either you are racist or you're anti-racist. So his point is that regardless of who you are, you could be participating and complicit with systems that perpetuate racist structures. If you are not confronting them, then you, unfortunately are obviously, participating in them. Whether it be intentional or you are unwittingly being a part of it, because you're more concerned about things social as opposed to really take into consideration the cost of discipleship. Once again, the cross on one hand, symbolic of hope and salvation, but then the lynching tree, which is the very negation of that kind of hope and salvation. And the idea, I think Cone has masterfully communicated the idea of merging those two thoughts so that we can begin to see the absolute horror and the terror associated with the cross is what will help us see today as brothers and sisters in Christ, or whatever religion one participates in, which is usually has as a foundation love as its guiding principle. When we have a deeper appreciation, though, for the idea that we have to turn this force of history that we carry around with us into a power that serves to liberate our brothers and sisters, regardless of what state they're in. Until we get to that point, I would dare say that we're playing church, we're not really the church of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ paid the price, and we're thankful for it. But he demonstrated by example what it means to speak truth to power.
Your comments about lynching in particular, and the sense in which that memory, that history is so vivid, makes me want to ask you, what is the impact of the high rate of incarceration among people of color on the individual, on families, on how people of color live and work and deal with the world around us today?
Absolutely. Well, you know, it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. It has become clearer and clearer day by day, not so much to Black people, but now to more of our white brothers and sisters, that people are being sent to jail for trumped up charges. When we even look at George Floyd, as we take a really good look at George Floyd's situation, the comfort by which Derek Chauvin was able to look into the camera while applying pressure on the neck of George Floyd was evidence that he thought perhaps that he would get off scot-free. But this has been going on for centuries. This is not a new phenomenon. Philando Castile, who said to the officer, "Hey, I have a gun permit," and then the officer still shoots him in the car in front of his girlfriend and his daughter. These kinds of things have been going on for centuries. That's not new. And so the high rate of incarceration of African Americans within today's penal system, Michelle Alexander said this is just a new Jim Crow. All these things have just evolved. Slavery didn't disappear. This is what all these scholars say. And Black people inherently say it. Slavery just didn't disappear. It evolved into all of these other kinds of systems, peonage, the caste system, the newfangled jail as we understand it today. The state has always, in one way, form or another, controlled Black bodies in such a way that's very reminiscent of what we saw during slavery. You know, a lot has changed, but then the more things change, the more things seem to stay the same. It's just a newfangled policy that seems to serve the same thing. When it comes to incarceration, do you not find it hypocritical and highly ironic that while in some states, weed, for instance, is legalized and people are becoming millionaires and billionaires off of the sale of it, while people are still in jail for having X amount of weed on them? Families have been decimated as a result of people going to jail for this alleged crime and this kind of thing. And it's just highly ironic. But the same thing with the cocaine and the crack. It depends on who's using it in terms of how the state administers justice. But jail and incarceration, as Michelle Alexander has eloquently pointed out in The New Jim Crow, and several scholars besides her, jail has completely decimated a lot of Black families. And it's unfortunate, but it is part and parcel of what we understand, in a land that we call America, with this racist construct that seems to be working very, very hard to uphold white supremacy, those kinds of things.
We're close to being out of time. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of summarize the question that we wanted to talk about, what white people don't understand. If you had to kind of make a summary statement, what are the most important things that it would be helpful for all of us if white people could learn to appreciate about people of color? And I have a guess you're going to talk about history. You're going to mention history, because we really need to be more aware of the history that you carry like a cross on your back.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy that we're still carrying this cross. But the thing that Baldwin talked about is that, history is very present with us. And so we're carrying history, and it provides us with a frame of reference. It provides us our sense of identity. And it also, kind of describes the aspirations that we would have. I think overall, it's important to realize that Black folks are not a monolithic entity. Obviously, just like white people, there are a host of different groups within the larger group, but we can't escape the social political realities, though, that are facing Black people as a whole. We represent, some 12% or 13% of the overall population, but a disproportionate number of those individuals are incarcerated in what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. We know because of pre-existing conditions that were brought about because of a lack of access that is going on currently. COVID-19 has disproportionately ravaged Black people around this nation and around the world. These things are real. This is going on in real time. When we look at the data, the wealth gap is astronomical, and it is impossible. Even Dr. King talked about it during the modern civil rights movement. How do you expect someone who is 300 years behind to catch up with one who had the 300-year head start? Those realities have continued to manifest themselves in community everywhere. Racial segregation is real. It is the stepchild of the civil human rights movement. And so we still have residential segregation, even in this city, while the segregation is in many ways, facilitated by the river that runs right through the city here. And then when you look at indices like child mortality, when you look at poverty, when you look at unemployment, when you look at home ownership, when you look at those who are renting, when you look at educational achievement, those who are dropping out, those who are impacted disproportionately, those who are on free lunches versus those who are not. All of those indices help paint the picture that while, a lot has been accomplished, the more things change, the more things stay the same, because some of those gaps that we see today are wider than they were when Dr. King was alive with respect to certain indices. And so, I guess I just want to conclude simply by saying that the possibilities have always been there, but overall, I think it's a lack of political will to do what we know we have the ability to do. With the same, quickness that we were able to provide the stimulus that was dispersed across the nation back here in March, was it, or April, is the same political will that we need to see when it comes to making society more equitable, more equal, in terms of building affordable housing, in terms of, making sure that we have well-educated and stable teachers to provide an equal and equitable educational experience for youth in public schools everywhere. The possibilities are there, but we just haven't seemingly mustered up the energy to do what is absolutely necessary to make this kind of thing happen. Not just for Black people, by the way, but for Indigenous people. I'm learning that, there's some judges that acknowledge that a significant portion of Oklahoma should go to certain Indian tribes, these kinds of things. The will to do the right thing has always, been there, but too many people have been quiet, too many people have been complicit in systems of oppression, and it's really hypocritical for us, when we wear our religious banners everywhere we go, to not understand that the origins of the religion that we hold up so proudly a lot of times goes back to a guy that was hung up on a cross, which was very similar to someone who was hung up on the lynching tree. And so instead of wearing these ornaments that are, ornately beautiful, but very harmless and non-offensive, we have to remember the lynching tree that was horrific and it was filled of terror. And then I think that would give us more of an appreciation for what Jesus actually did for those of us who are on the line who are Christians or religionists or what have you. That we have a better understanding for the historical Jesus who was crucified by the state. The cat was standing up for what he believed. He took his calling seriously and he followed it all the way through until he was crucified by the state. And in some ways, that is offensive when we think about what we have or have not done in order to advance the cause of love and grace and equality in our nation and in our community. The opportunity is always there, though, for the heart to break open. And so as we continue to move forward on our journey, as we move along the spiritual migration, we hope that we will continue to engage in meaningful and courageous conversations like this one, so that we give opportunity for the heart to continue to break open in such a way that we might be able to embrace the ideals that are necessary in order to make community a wonderful place for all of us and not just some of us.
Thank you very much. That's a good place to leave it, because next week, Reg Green is going to be with us.
Yes.
And I think actually it follows on from this discussion in the sense that I think what Reg is going to try to do is help us as white people to see our history and how we have to become more aware of that, which, these days goes by the label white privilege, and what we need to see what we carry and what we need to be more honest about. So I think that will be a good conversation as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Reg, and
yeah, I do.
He's very passionate about this, and I think very positive and helpful.
Sure.
I hope in our conversation. So, Reverend Funches, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your willingness to share with us.
I appreciate the invite. Thank you, Director Christian.
Series. I want to say to the rest of our people who are viewing the program, thank you for joining us. Remind you again to, if you're on the Waterloo Catholics Summer Forum page, to go to the bottom. You see the instructions there on how to submit questions to Reverend Funches that I will pass on. And then we can post those later. And also to take time to fill out, use the link to fill out an evaluation. So thank you all for watching tonight. And I hope you can come back and join us next Thursday at 7 o'clock. Reverend Funches, good night. Blessings to you.
Blessings to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.